In this third video on Edmund Burke, we're going to zoom in now to his concept of the sublime. And he defines sublime as a form of astonishment. Okay, astonishment. There we go. He writes, the sublime is that state of the soul in which all its motions are suspended with some degree of horror. You remember that terror is a really big part of the sublime. So we are astonished by something, and Burke points out that in Latin, attonitus, the word where this comes from, actually means thunderstruck. It's as if we've been hit by lightning. And that's an image that also Longinus, the classical writer on the sublime, uses as well. So to describe then the various features that make up the sublime and cause it, I have here for you a couple of paintings and also a photo. Now, the first painting here is called The 3rd of May, 1808 by Francisco Goya, and it shows a number of Spanish soldiers who have rebelled against the French forces occupying their country. They're being executed here. Our second image is called Seashore by Moonlight. It's by the German romantic painter Caspar David Friedrich, and it's from around 1835, 1836. And then our last image, in this case a photo, is of the Parthenon, the Greek temple. As we go through this then, we'll look at each of these and we'll try to figure out what are some of these essential aspects of the sublime that Burke talks about. Now, the first of these, obviously, is terror and fear. When we experience these from a distance, as long as we're somewhat safe ourselves, then we can experience the sublime. Burke points out that animals are often terrifying. He also points out that the ocean can be terrifying because we don't know what's underneath the surface, right? And in this painting by Friedrich, even the clouds above the ocean are kind of scary and looming and ominous. Another feature of the sublime is power. So power is very important. In our painting here, we see the power of the state. And Burke talks a lot about tyrants and kings that can impress us with their power. The more unpredictable, the more arbitrary, the scarier it is. Again, animals can be powerful too, and so can God. And it's fascinating that Burke tends to reduce God to one attribute, that he's primarily known in terms of his awe-inspiring power. And Burke here reduces God quite a lot. He doesn't talk much about goodness and love and things like that. And maybe that's a feature of the time. So in the Enlightenment, God is often seen as reason, right? And when you look at the Romantics later, they tend to follow Burke in describing God as perhaps arbitrary, perhaps cruel, because of his power. So Milton's Satan then, as we said before, becomes the hero of the poem because he's rebelling against a God who is primarily powerful, and nobody loves a tyrannous king. So you can see how the French Revolution plays into that as well. We're kind of getting carried away here, but there's a lot of significance to this depiction of the sublime as being inspired by power. Do we find powerful and tyrannous governments more awe-inspiring than good ones? I sure hope not. Another feature is obscurity, darkness, and this can come in many different forms. You can see it in these first two paintings quite clearly. There's a lot of darkness here. For Burke, things like temples, churches, right? Nighttime. If there's darkness and obscurity, this can add to the sublime effect. Although he does point out that light itself can be sublime too, especially if we are entering from the dark outside world into a space that's entirely lit up, like a room full of light. That can be quite sublime. Other things that have an aspect of obscurity are words. Words are not super clear in representing the real world, so there's obscurity there. And also concepts like eternity, for instance. if the concept is obscure and hard to fathom, what is eternity, right? Then that can be sublime as well. A fairly minor feature of the sublime is what we might call potential. And we see potential all over the place. We see it, for instance, in the seasons. When it's springtime and the flowers are growing, we see the potential that's there, and summer is going to be the fruition of that potential. We see it in young people, and perhaps in this painting where these young people are dying, we see the loss of that potential, which obviously is quite tragic. An unfinished sketch, for this reason, can also be sublime, and that's why in art you see a lot of pieces that are actually left unfinished intentionally, because it creates that kind of sense of potential and perhaps also the sublime. Burke likes his colors kind of on the dark side. He likes browns and black and purple and things like that. Not too bright, not too cheery, at least when it comes to the sublime. When it comes to the beautiful, he likes his colors more vibrant and so on. Another feature is privation. So privation is where we are deprived of experiences. And in our second example, we can really see this. So here we experience things like emptiness, loneliness, solitude, silence, and privation then is a big part of the sublime. Another feature is vastness. Vastness. The size of things. You can see with the ocean, the way it stretches on for a long time or long ways. We see it with the Parthenon here, that these pillars go on, and again, the notion of potential is here as well. Burke suggests that what architects should do is give the impression of things going on. These pillars don't go on ad infinitum, but they go on far enough that we get the impression of infinity. So infinity is a feature of the sublime. And we can't express or describe all of infinity, we just give the merest impression of it. Related to this then, with these pillars, is the notion of succession and uniformity. Uniformity. Burke writes that if you have pillars alternating, like one is round, one is square, and so on, that doesn't work quite as well. The eye doesn't get the same pattern all the way through, or the repetition of a uniform section, and so the eye doesn't get that sense of infinity in the same way. As an aside here, Burke also talks about churches having this pattern. So if you look at the side of a church, we'll just draw a quick church here, keep it across. When you look at the side of it, you see all these flying buttresses, right, going on. And that creates a very pleasing effect too. Although one thing that Burke complains about is that often with a church, it has the shape of a cross. Okay, this is from the top down. And if you're looking along the side, then your view gets interrupted because this part of the building is sticking out and it interrupts your view. So Burke doesn't really like that. And in fact, he hates angles. No angles, please. He says this again and again. He doesn't like angles in architecture. Make things smooth and stylistically pleasing. Don't give me so many angles. All right, a few last features here to talk about. So we've talked about vastness. He also mentions magnitude, which is a similar kind of thing. Magnitude. Okay, that's also important to him. He mentions magnificence, and by this he means something like a great profusion of things. If you look up at the stars at night, then, well, they're not in this painting because the clouds are in the way, but if you look at the stars at night, there's so many of them that their profusion, their magnificence is awe-inspiring. One thing that we haven't mentioned yet is difficulty. For instance, the difficulty of building the Parthenon, or even the difficulty of painting a really inspiring piece. Burke mentions that Stonehenge is awe-inspiring just because we can't fathom how primitive people could have built such an immense structure like that. Sounds can be amazingly sublime as well. Sounds. Now, the kinds of sounds that are sublime are ones that are dramatic. So if you think of the sound of guns going off, they're scary sounds. They're also sounds that surprise us. So for instance, a sound in the night, like a foghorn going, if we start to anticipate the pattern, we listen for it, and then it still surprises us, these are the kinds of things that Burke finds sublime. I think we've mentioned most of the causes. There might be some other ones like smells and so on that Burke talks about, but this should give you a very accurate sense of how Burke understands the sublime as a form of astonishment, and then how he goes through all these different aspects to kind of fill in the details.